Okay, so we are back here for part 2 of the marine mammal lectures. And this lecture will focus on a new order, which is order Pinnipedia. So if you remember from our last lecture, we covered order Carnivora, which was your sea otter, your marine otter, and your polar bears. And then we did order Sirenia, which was your manatees and your dugongs. So here we're going to talk about the pinnipeds. And your pinnipeds are going to be your seals, as you can see here, and your sea lions. So we're going to talk about your seals, your sea lions, and your walrus. And sorry, I didn't have a picture of walrus up here. And then we will kind of talk about the general characteristics of them and then kind of go into each individual group. So, oops, it won't advance for me. There we go. So when we talk about pinnipeds, the term pinniped actually means winged-footed. So ped, you can think of like podiatrist, has to do with your feet, right? So pinny, you might not know, pinny means winged. So pinnipeds or pinnipedia means winged foot. So you can see how they get that name here with these large flippers here. They do have these very streamlined bodies for swimming, and you can see that they're quite streamlined and hydrodynamic here to help reduce resistance as they swim through the water. And then they are carnivorous. They do feed on primarily fish and squid. Although we'll talk about walruses are a bit different in that they are primarily feeding on some invertebrates. And then these guys are mostly cold water species. So they do have a very thick layer of blubber to insulate them. And we'll talk about how that blubber works to, here, actually I talked about it right here. So that blubber works in a number of different ways for them. One, the blubber again helps to insulate them from that colder water and helps them to maintain that internal body temperature that's much warmer than their surroundings. Remember, these guys are homeothermic. They also will use that blubber as a food reserve. So again, this provides, remember, even in us, our kind of long-term storage for food is stored as fat. So these guys, again, have this kind of more long-term storage for food in the form of blubber. And then also that blubber provides buoyancy because, again, it's less dense than the surrounding seawater. So a couple different ways in which that blubber really works to their advantage. Seals, sea lions, and walruses are all considered part of the order Pinnipedia. And believe it or not, the pinniped's closest living relative is actually bears. So these guys have evolved from some terrestrial ancestor and then have since reinvaded a marine environment, just like we've talked about with all of your marine mammals. Oops, I'm sorry, I just skipped to that. And then there are 4 families of pinnipeds that we're going to talk about here. So let's get into them. So the first family that we're going to talk about is the family Odobenidae. And Odobenidae is the family, it's just kind of a fun family name to say, right? Odobenidae. And so these guys are the walrus. And you'll see here again, if you look at seals and sea lions and walrus, they have this kind of similar body plan. But obviously a big difference here is you'll see that the walrus has these 2 large, well-developed canines that form tusks. So again, that's a very big key difference. You'll see here on land, when they haul out onto land, you'll see oftentimes they turn pink in coloration. So here you can see this walrus has just hauled out from the really cold surrounding waters. You can see this walrus in the water here, and they look almost white. And that's because their blood vessels will constrict away from the surface to help conserve heat. And then when they haul out on land and their body temperature starts to warm up, these blood vessels at the surface here will really dilate to help release heat. Our blood vessels do the same thing when we're really hot. If you've ever looked at your superficial blood vessels, on your I have really large blood vessels in my hands, so whenever I am really hot, they really dilate and you can really see them at the surface. And that's a way for us as mammals to be able to release some of that excess heat, especially as we sweat and do some evaporative cooling. So again, these walruses will turn pink when they heat up, so that way then, again, they can get rid of that excess heat as those blood vessels dilate. That's what I have here. So again, they are pink in warm weather when the tiny blood vessels in the skin dilate and the circulation increases, and that helps to shed that extra body heat. So that's why they turn pink when they haul out onto land. So walruses are our largest pinniped, and they primarily are going to be found in the Arctic and subarctic waters. So again, your cooler waters, they rely on those cooler waters. They also need to inhabit shallow water, and that's primarily because of the food that they eat, which we'll talk about in just a minute in terms of feeding on invertebrates. They do have these huge canine teeth, these very well-developed canine teeth that have formed what we now call tusks. So tusks are basically just these really pronounced and long canine teeth. And so do both male and females have them? And that's always a question in terms of, you know, if you ask that question, like, why do walruses have tusks? And what's interesting is why walruses have tusks today, and the main reason for those tusks today in terms of their main purpose is actually likely different than the reason that they evolved, and I'll show you kind of a short video on this. But males and females both do have tusks. And so, you know, then this begs the question, do males oftentimes have longer tusks? And is this something that's used for mate selection? And so again, we typically would have a discussion on this. I don't have you here to have the discussion. So it would be, you know, radio silence as I ask these questions. But so we usually kind of have an open discussion about this. And what we end up coming to find out is that they do, in fact, use these tusks as mate selection. And bull males will actually use them to fight during mating season. And walruses, like we had talked about previously when we talked about polygynous, walruses are also polygynous or polygynous, whichever you can pronounce it both ways. I usually will pronounce it polygynous. But they are polygynous, and that means that typically these males will be in groups with, you know, a bunch of females. So one male will have his harem of females, and those females select that male, and that male is selected for by, again, being the, you know, largest male, the most successful male in terms of fighting off other bull males during mating season to protect that harem. So those tusks are in fact used for mate selection. However, that's not what we think the main purpose of the tusks are today. Today, you know, there's a lot of evidence to show that they use those tusks to haul themselves out of the water and to continually keep breathing holes open and to crack those breathing holes in the ice from underneath, so that they do have these breathing holes in the ice. And so they've kind of, you know, evolved that purpose. However, what's interesting is that if you go back and look through evolutionary history, their tusks actually more likely evolved due to mate selection. So again, this idea of having these tusks to be able to fight off other males to select for their harem. So anyway, I'm just going to let you watch a little bit of this video. It's quite interesting on the kind of fossil records that they have in terms of walruses. And let me pull this up. Really interesting in terms of how, sorry, there's the advertisements, how these walruses developed tusks.
California was covered by a shallow inland sea, and this sea was filled with exotic marine life. Ancient seals, massive sea turtles, and giant megalodon sharks, which I want to remind you are super duper extinct. And there were also walruses. 3 different species of them, which it turns out were kind of odd, because at least one of them definitely didn't have tusks, and the other 2 probably didn't either, which just seems strange to me. Like, if they didn't have tusks, then how did scientists know that these animals were walruses? Aren't they a key feature of what we consider to be walrusness? And if you can be a walrus without tusks, then why does the only species of walrus alive today have them? Modern walruses are literally named for these features. Their genus name means tooth-walking because they've been observed pulling themselves out of the water with their tusks. But there used to be all kinds of walruses in the ocean. The fossil record has revealed a huge diversity of extinct walruses, something like 20 different species, stretching from Florida to Japan and dating back to the early Miocene epoch. So where'd they all go? Why is the modern Arctic walrus the only one still around? The rise and fall of ancient walruses and how modern ones got their tusks is a story that spans almost 20 million years. And while there are still parts of the story that we're trying to figure out, it looks like tusks, which are literally just enlarged upper canine teeth, didn't have anything to do with how or what these animals ate. Instead, the walrus probably got its tusks because of sex. The earliest known fossils of walruses have been found in Japan, Oregon, and California, and they're from the early Miocene epoch, around 17 million years ago. They were all smaller than their modern relative, and none of them had tusks. And a couple million years later, when those 3 species were swimming around the Central Valley, walruses had already started to diversify, developing different body sizes and diets. But again, at least one of them definitely didn't have tusks. So paleontologists had to use other features to recognize them as walruses. It turns out tusks are not one of these animals' defining features. Instead, they can be identified by a wide bone on the upper jaw that's found only in walruses, as well as a characteristic ear bone and really big molars. Now, fast forward to the late Miocene, about 10 million years ago, and we find fossils of another 2 species in Japan. They were both on the smaller side, and at least one of them had sharp teeth for eating fish, but again, no tusks. The presence of all these early species shows us that these marine mammals diversified really quickly. By 10 million years ago, 6 species had already become extinct, but 3 more species had shown up in the fossil record to take their place. And this was just the beginning. Paleontologists think that these animals diversified so quickly because they were geographically isolated. As sea levels rose and fell over millions of years, different populations became separated from each other and started to evolve independently. Now, looking forward another couple million years to about 8 million years ago, we find fossils of an enormous walrus in Oregon and California. Pontolis was the size of a modern elephant seal, with a big long skull. But while its canines were sharp and fang-like, they didn't stick out of its mouth. It would be another million years before the first tusked walrus appeared. Behold, Gomphotaria. It was also pretty huge, and it had short, stout tusks on both the upper and lower jaws, as well as these weird tusk-like third incisors. And it didn't eat fish like its ancestors did. Instead, it fed on shellfish. Judging from the extreme wear that's been found on its teeth and tusks, it looked like it just crushed them up, shells and all. Okay, but so what drove the evolution of tusks in walruses? This is the question that has puzzled paleontologists for years, because for a very long time, walruses were obviously doing just fine without them. The first hypothesis was that tusks evolved to stabilize a walrus's head while it trawled the seafloor for food, kind of like the runners on a sled. But Gomphotaria's tusks were short and stout, and their shape made them not really useful for stabilizing a big skull. So the second hypothesis was that tusks evolved to help them pick their way across the ice. Scientists came up with this idea after watching living walruses use their tusks to haul themselves onto ice floes. But Gomphotaria lived in temperate warm waters where there was no ice. And another species of tusked walrus had also been found in places that were warm and ice-free in the late Miocene. Places like South Carolina, the Netherlands, and Morocco. So tusks probably didn't evolve as ice picks. That leaves the third hypothesis, that they were used in competition between males for mates, but not always in the way you might think. Walruses today spar with their tusks, competing to monopolize groups of females. The males posture and jab at each other, sometimes even drawing blood. So that made scientists wonder whether male competition was at work in early walruses too. Because in animals where males compete for groups of mates, you tend to also see differences in body size between the sexes, with males being bigger than females. And looking back in the fossil record, we find evidence that one of the species from California's Central Valley had bigger males than females. In fact, if you look even further back in their history, you'd find this pattern of having larger males in the ancestors of walruses that lived more than 20 million years ago. So it looks like walruses were polygynous, living in groups of one male and many females from the very start of their lineage. So this suggests that competition between males was common and may have eventually driven the evolution of tusks. Okay, but here's the thing. Big tusks can be used as weapons, but they're also useful for display. and traits like these can be acted on by sexual selection. Sexual selection is a type of natural selection that's driven by competition for mates. It includes males fighting other males over females, and also includes one sex preferring certain traits in the other sex. As I'm sure you've noticed in other animals, sexual selection tends to produce big, showy structures in males, like deer antlers or peacock's tails. In fact, the most well-studied example of sexual selection is probably in deer. The fossil record shows that as deer diversified into many species, their antlers diversified too. And in deer, paleontologists think that antlers evolved as weapons for fighting at first, but eventually took on a new, separate role as a sexual display. And in walruses, evolutionary biologists see the incredible diversity of tusks over the last 8 million years as similar evidence of sexual selection. When tusks became indicators of fitness, the thinking goes, male competition for mates didn't have to be lethal. Instead, the dudes could just intimidate each other with displays. So the fact is, the most elaborate structures in males rarely inflict damage in fighting. Instead, they serve as indicators of a male's status, size, and health. But having these huge tusks came at a cost, because like I mentioned, the earliest walruses were fish eaters. But ones with tusks don't eat fish because their giant canines get in the way of them catching them. So these walruses shifted to another mode of feeding as their tusks got bigger and bigger due to sexual selection. We can see this, for example, in the Pliocene walrus known as Valanictus. It had no teeth except for its tusks. But the arched palate in its mouth allowed it to create a vacuum that it could use to suck up mollusks from the sediment. And today's walrus does have teeth, but it doesn't use them for feeding. It just noses through sediments looking for mollusks like clams, feeling around with its sensitive whiskers and just sucking the animal right out of the shell. So, in their long history, walruses evolved from having sharp teeth for eating fish to having giant tusks for competition and display. And the evolution of tusks coincided with the incredible diversification of walruses. Over time, there have been at least 21 species in 18 different genera, with today's walrus being the only surviving representative of that group. Now, there are still gaps to fill in the fossil record, but it's clear that the diversity of these animals was a roller coaster, rising and falling several times as climate and sea levels changed over millions of years.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop it there. That gives you kind of the majority of the history on the evolution of walruses. And the reason that I wanted to play that video, I know it was a little bit long, was just because I think it's always interesting to go back and look at, you know, what we originally think of as being kind of the evolution of a structure and the purpose of that structure may be very different today than the reason for its evolution in the first place. So again, maybe, you know, for today, even though the main purpose of those tusks is really to ensure that they're able to haul themselves out of the water and onto the ice, and to be able to crack breathing holes in the ice, it's still a very important part of their mate selection and sexual selection. And that likely comes from its evolutionary history here. So again, the reason that these tusks even evolved in the first place was actually for, you know, mate selection. So kind of interesting when you look at the fossil records, and it's nice that we have pretty detailed fossil records of our pinnipeds. So really interesting story on kind of the history of how walruses got their tusks. And he does a pretty good job. Oops, I'm sorry about that, guys. I didn't mean to open that. He does a pretty good job of getting through that pretty quickly, which is nice. Okay, so what do walruses feed upon? So again, just as you learned, you know, the evolution of those tusks came at a price. And so they were unable to capture fish prey with these really large tusks. And so walruses mainly feed on bottom-dwelling invertebrates, primarily clams. They love clams, snails, crabs, shrimps, and sometimes worms even. And those are those polychaete worms. And they'll use their whiskers. Their whiskers are specialized for being able, they have basically tactile sensation or touch sensation. So they use those whiskers, or what we call them as vibrissae. So they'll use these vibrissae to be able to feel around to find food on the seafloor. So we give these whiskers this special name, vibrissae, because they're used, vibrissae are whiskers that are used for touch, for tactile sensation or touch. So again, they'll use those whiskers as they're kind of shuffling around on the bottom of the seafloor to be able to detect things like clams and snails and crabs. And they then often blow kind of at the sediment to get the food loose and cause it to move. And that's mainly because their tusks get in the way. So again, they have to kind of position their head back because they're large canines, their tusks make it a little challenging for them to feed. So I have a quick video. I'm gonna fast forward to, I think it's at 1:16. So that you guys can see what these walruses look like feeding. You're welcome to watch the whole video. There is a little profanity at one point because these National Geographic scientists are talking about how challenging it is to photograph these walruses. So but there is one instance where there's just in case you have kids. But you can fast forward to 1:16 like we're doing here, and this is where he finally is able to.
Yeah, this looks really good, promising. Paul hasn't been swimming so much. He's following a walrus right now. So this is hopefully what we've been waiting for, a calm animal, good conditions, and everything
Those are
makes
good
sense.
conditions.
I love close encounters with animals. I like that intimacy, a bit of adrenaline, and that trying to be the fly on the wall, getting a glimpse into its world, seeing what nobody else has seen. The scientist in me, the biologist in me, is very curious to see the fanning behavior of the flippers and how they use their vibrissae to locate the clams in the sediment and sucking them out and then popping the shells. Can you imagine being 6 inches away from a walrus that's feeding as it feeds right by your camera, right by your knees, by your hands? You know, it's an incredible experience that I'll definitely never forget.
He was quite excited that he got the footage there. So yeah, you could see how they, again, use those vibrissae or vibrissae, depending on if you're talking about the plural or not. So they'll use those vibrissae to be able to detect where their prey is, and then they'll kind of blow at that sediment to kind of loosen up their food so that they can grasp that food. So again, just kind of interesting way in which walruses have to eat. You know, not easy to feed when you have evolved these really large canine teeth. Okay, so the next two families that we're going to talk about are the sea lions and the seals. And really quick here, I'm going to talk about some of the things that they have in common and then some of their main differences. I do want you to be able to recognize the difference between a sea lion versus a seal because there are some pretty, as you're going to find out, some pretty stark differences between their physiology. And they're pretty easy, once you know these stark differences, to identify whether or not you're looking at a sea lion versus a seal. So first, I want to talk about some of the things that they have in common. Both, again, of these pinnipeds, along with, again, walruses, will keep warm with blubber. And that blubber, as we talked about, acts as insulation. It serves as food reserves, and it also helps with buoyancy. So again, it has all these great functions. But the other interesting thing about your pinnipeds is because, again, they are typically inhabiting colder waters, many of them are quite large. And what this does is the larger an organism is, the lower the surface area to volume ratio is. So what that means is they have less surface area exposed per their actual total volume, okay? And that's a good thing in terms of if you're trying to conserve heat, because remember, the more surface area you have per your body weight, the more likely you are, again, to lose heat to the surrounding environment. Again, we experience this right when we get into a pool, and you think, oh, the pool is like 72 degrees. It's pretty warm, right? But then all of a sudden you rapidly cool down because we have so much surface area exposed, right? And we are continually losing our heat to the surrounding water. So again, to kind of counter that, seals and sea lions have these really, big bodies. They're quite large, and they have less surface area exposed per their body volume. So again, a great way to conserve heat. So let's talk about the differences between sea lions versus seals. Again, they're pretty stark. You're going to first notice, and this is actually when we talk about the name for these families, we'll talk about the fact that sea lions are named after the fact that they have this external ear right here. And then if you look at seals, seals have no external ear. So that's one of the big differences. Again, sea lions have this external ear, seals, no external ear. Also, you'll notice that sea lions will have this long neck, and they're actually able to turn in the water with that neck. So I'm going to show you a picture that I took here. You can see of a sea lion when I was diving. We were diving down in Mexico, and there are some areas where there's sea lion rookeries, and you can get in the water, and the females and the pups are quite playful. You just have to watch out for if a bull male enters the water, you gotta hightail it out. But you can see that they can turn themselves and arc their neck. This is something, again, that your seals can't do. So again, this long neck gives them the ability to turn in water pretty easily. And again, these guys have a short neck. So when you look at the anterior and the posterior flippers, here's some really big differences between them. So if you look at these anterior flippers in a sea lion, they're able to rotate them backwards. And this allows them to move more easily on land, especially on like rocky shore habitats. And where you're going to find seals primarily hauling themselves out on ice. So that's one of the big differences in terms of those anterior flippers. So again, those anterior flippers can rotate backwards to support their weight, to help keep their head up and erect. And then if you look at the edge of them, it's not covered with hair or nails. And that's really to help reduce some of that resistance, that water resistance, and make them more streamlined as they're swimming. And then they will use those anterior flippers in swimming. And so again, you can even kind of see that here where they're using, this sea lion was using its anterior flippers to kind of try to catch up to my fin there, which it was chasing. So again, just some key differences. And then when you look at the seal here, the anterior flippers are covered with hair. You can distinctly see these 5 toes with these really sharp nails, and they're going to use those sharp nails to kind of pull themselves along and out of the ice. So they use those sharp nails to dig into the ice. So again, that's one of the main differences and why they have these differences in flippers. And then they cannot rotate these backwards. They can kind of just pull their whole arm back, but they can't rotate the flipper back like you see here, where this part of the flipper is rotated back. These guys don't have the ability to do that. Here, these guys, if you're looking closely, they do have external testicles in the males, although you might be a little too close to the males if you're able to see that. So, beware, especially if you've got bull males with their harem of females around. They get quite defensive. So I wouldn't suggest that would be your way in which you're identifying the differences between them. And then here, these guys have no external testicles in males, which again makes sense because again, these guys are living in much colder waters and colder environments. Here, posterior flippers can be moved forward or rotated forward here. And here, the posterior flippers cannot be moved forward, and they're used primarily in swimming. So again, they're not really used to help them maneuver on land, where here, in sea lions, they can move those posterior flippers forward to help them maneuver on land. They kind of waddle on land. And that's another big difference. If you see a sea lion moving around on land, they're going to kind of waddle, where a seal is really going to be kind of like pulling themselves along with these front flippers. They kind of look like an inchworm kind of pulling itself along. So those are some of the main differences in your seals and your sea lions. And I'll go through this again in just a minute. I have another slide. So again, when you separate these two out, they're separated into two different families. And so here, the family Otaridae is the eared seals, and it literally means, again, the eared seals. So these guys are called sea lions or eared seals, but obviously you're going to most likely hear them called sea lions. And you can notice here, it's very easy to see those anterior flippers are rotated backward and those posterior flippers are rotated forward. So pretty easy to see that. Again, also you can see how they can use their head and that long neck to be able to turn themselves. And then you can also see that external ear flap here as well. And oftentimes these guys are quite playful, especially if you get the pups. And the pups hop in the water, and they love to chase your fins. And sometimes they will nibble and bite at them. But they're quite fun in terms of how playful they are. Sea lions and fur seals versus seals. So again, this is just all of those same characteristics that we just talked about. I just put them out here in case it made it easier for you in terms of your studying. So I'm not going to go through them again because they're just the same exact ones that I just talked about. So as you can see here, it should be pretty obvious that these guys are actually seals, and so they're in a different family. We call them the phocids, or family Phocidae. And these guys, again, have these posterior flippers, you can see, that they're not able to rotate them forward, and they kind of just drag them along behind them when they haul out on the ice. And then you can see these anterior flippers here are heavily furred. So, and then you can't really see here, but they do have prominent claws. So seals, not sea lions. Again, all the things that distinguish them. They're distinguished by these rear flippers that can't be moved forward. They just drag them along behind themselves on land. They swim with these powerful strokes of the rear flippers, whereas sea lions will also use their anterior flippers as well. But seals are going to primarily just use their rear flippers in swimming. And some of your common seals, the ones that you're more commonly likely to see on like some of the videos and things like that, are harbor seals and elephant seals, monk seals, and crab eater seals. And some of you may have even seen some of these harbor seals off the coast of California. Seals have typically been hunted for their skin and for their meat, as well as their oil from their blubber for extraction. And so we did see drastic declines in both seals and sea lions. And that was up until the Marine Mammal Protection Act was put in place in the United States in 1972. And that Marine Mammal Protection Act actually restricts the sale of any imports or exports of marine mammal products into and out of the United States. So again, if you go to another country and you want to buy, seal skull, you will not be allowed to bring that back into the United States because, again, they want to discourage that with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And then in the United States, it's illegal to obviously, kill any marine mammal or harm any marine mammal unless you have, there are certain special permits that they give to some of these native Alaskan communities that rely on these marine mammals, and they call this a subsistence take. It means that they need that marine mammal for survival of these groups and tribes of these native communities. So again, there are a few cases, but they have special permits that allow for those takes. Other than that, you are not allowed to even harass a seal or sea lion. And so we'll talk about what that means in just a minute, or towards the end of the lecture here. So obviously I don't have time to talk about all of the seals and sea lions because we could do a whole class on like a whole 15-week semester just on marine mammals. And so what instead I want to do is just give you a couple representatives of seals that actually have different feeding strategies. So this is called the crab eater seal, and they're one of the most abundant seals in the world. And these guys, believe it or not, being the most abundant seal in the world, have a pretty low survival rate. So about 80% of these seals never survive to age 1. They're fall to predation by, higher predators, things like orcas and actually even other seals. So they end up having kind of a pretty rough start in life. But with that and with the protection that they have today, again, they are right now the most abundant seal. And we'll talk about these guys primarily actually feed on krill, which is kind of interesting. So we'll talk about the structure of their teeth and how they're able that structure of their teeth. It has evolved basically to allow them to trap and feed on krill. So we'll talk about that coming up here. Now, if you look here, an easy way to identify that this is a seal, again, short neck, no external ears here. You can see again the fur on these anterior flippers, and then they've got really pronounced claws there, you can see. And also again, they're not using them on land to rotate them backward to be able to hobble on land. They're just going to pull themselves out and then also drag those flippers from behind them. And then you can see when they're swimming, they're primarily using those posterior flippers when they're swimming. The elephant seal is the largest of our pinnipeds, and you can see they kind of have this long proboscis-like structure that sticks off here, their snout, and that's typically in males. And you see that in males for the purpose of mate selection as well as for fighting off other males. And you can see this male here was likely to be protecting his harem and was fighting for the right to that harem with another male. So you can see they oftentimes get bloodied in terms of their battles with other males. And so those are the elephant seals. Now, if you look at the female elephant seals will not have that large proboscis. I didn't include, I don't think, do I have a video here of, I don't, it's not pulling up here. I thought I had a video of the elephant seals here, but it's not, it's got an error. So I'll post a video for you of these elephant seal males that are kind of battling it out, so you can see what those battles look like. They're kind of a little rough to watch sometimes because they can get quite bloody, and that's just part of what they do in terms of fighting for that harem. So again, your pinnipeds are going to have these breeding colonies. And again, sea lions and many seal species, along with their walrus, are polygynous. And that, again, is that mating pattern in which one male is going to mate with more than one female. In a breeding season, he's going to have kind of a breeding group of females, and we typically call that a harem. So one male will fight for that right to his harem as well. And that ensures that the females are actually, mating with the most successful male. So the most dominant successful male that's able to fight off the other males is, the one that those females will choose. Now, bachelor groups, what we call bachelor groups, are not nearly as successful, but they do have these little groups called bachelor groups. And they're usually these like younger males. And what the younger males will do is they'll kind of hang out of sight from that bull male, kind of on the outskirts. And then they'll try to sneak a mate with a female. Now, they have to be quick because the female will oftentimes call out to the bull male because she doesn't necessarily want to mate with the less successful male. And so it's risky business, but sometimes some of these bachelor males are successful by doing that. It's just kind of a strategy that they've developed. Now, the biggest and most interesting thing with these breeding colonies is this idea of delayed implantation. And again, we've already talked about delayed implantation, so hopefully you kind of remember what that means. We talked about this with sea otters. And so it's going to serve a very similar purpose here. So, typically, mating season for your seals and sea lions oftentimes occurs in summer. So this will coincide with what we call their pupping season, which is typically when they give birth to their pups. So oftentimes the females will come up. Pupping season's usually early summer in June, and the mating season will follow shortly after. So they'll come up on shore, and then they'll go ahead and give birth to these pups. And then they can, while they're on shore there, they can go ahead and mate with the males. Now, the challenge is, of course, that being a marine mammal, they do have this energy expenditure afterwards of having to provide milk for their pup. And it's a really energy expenditure process because they produce this really high fat milk for their pup so that that pup can quickly develop the blubber that it needs, needs to be able to keep itself warm. The other challenge kind of going along with this is that, typically their gestation is about 9 months. And so they really want to time their pupping with coming out on shore to mate. And so, and primarily this occurs because if you think about it, if they were to, if they were to mate in summer, okay, 9 months later would put them sometime, again, around early spring, around March. And typically the weather conditions aren't great then for pupping. Food resources are poor. And so typically weather is a bit more drastic. There's more violent storms then. So it's really a tough time for a newborn pup to survive. I mean, they're much more likely to survive if they could make it to summer, okay? So what happens is the female has this delayed implantation. So again, she will, in the summertime, mate, fertilization will happen, and then after that egg's fertilized, it'll kind of go in this dormant state for about 3 months before it'll actually implant in the uterus. And so that's that delayed implantation. Again, in us as humans, right after fertilization occurs, implantation occurs shortly after. So again, this delayed implantation is definitely an evolutionary adaptation, that we've seen for the reasons of, again, ensuring the success in the right pupping season, as well as that the female can have the resources that she needs to be able to put into the development of that egg. So it's kind of interesting in how they do this. So again, what really ends up happening is the female will come up on shore kind of one last time. She will give birth to her pup. Then she can shortly after become receptive to mating with a male. If, again, she ends up mating with a male and the egg's fertilized, it will kind of go into this dormant state for about 3 months. And that gives her a good amount of time to really put all of her resources into milk production for that pup that she just had. And then, again, at about 3 months, that egg will go ahead and implant, and then she'll have the 9-month gestation, which will put her at next summer to come up on land and do the whole process again, pup, and then give birth to her pup, and then go ahead and mate again. So again, kind of interesting in terms of that process of delayed implantation and the evolution of that. It's very, very successful. Okay, let's see. Okay, and so we just kind of talked about this. Sorry, I kind of already went over this, so you can read through that, but that was what I just went over in terms of that gestation being less than a year. And so, again, the mother can't have the pup prior to return to the breeding grounds. So again, she has this delayed implantation up 3 to 4 months, typically, is that delayed implantation. And then again, that allows her to be quite successful in coming up on land at the right time to pup and mate. So when we look at the males look quite a bit different than the females. If you look, here's a female, and if you look at her head, it's quite a bit different than the males. The males have this kind of large bulge here, and that large bulge is due to what we call a sagittal crest. It's part of the skull that develops and kind of sticks up in the center here. And that sagittal crest is really important for the attachment of jaw muscles to that area. And so what happens is when males typically hit that sexual maturation point where, again, they become sexually mature and able to mate, they will start to release hormones that actually help develop that, will signify kind of, or drive, the hormones will drive really the development of that sagittal crest in the jaw, in the skull. And that way then it gives them this large sagittal crest here, up here, for those jaw muscles to attach to. And the reason that they think they have this is they need those really strong jaw muscles to help defend the colony, especially their harem. So kind of interesting, you can actually identify this as a way in which you can identify males from females. So we call this, again, sexually dioecious, a characteristic that we can see externally that shows us the difference between females, which again have this much smaller head than the males here, which have this big sagittal crest that sticks up here. And so again, you can see here's a female that just gave birth to her pup. This is what a pup looks like just after it's born. And then again, that pup, the pinnipeds are nursed for periods of 4 days is on the really short end. I don't, they had this out there, but that's really unusual, on up to 2 years. But I would say most of your pups are nursed at least for a year. And so you can see here is a juvenile. And so that just gives you an idea of how, again, reproduction occurs in pinnipeds. So now we're going to talk, I meant to kind of move this around in my lecture, but I didn't get it moved around, so I apologize. Now we're going to kind of go back and kind of talk about what do pinnipeds eat. And mainly I'm going to give you kind of two contrasting differences between what pinnipeds eat. So here, and the cool part is you can actually look at the skull and the dentition, meaning the structure of the teeth, to really be able to help you identify how they're able to feed on and what they're able to eat. So this is your crab eater seal, and this is your leopard seal. So the crab eater seal, if you look, has these teeth with these kind of strange little grooves on the sides here. And the reason that they have those little grooves is these guys are primarily feeding on krill. And so what they'll do is they'll kind of much like a whale, they'll take in a big gulp of water, and then what they'll do is they'll take their tongue and push it up and push the water out their teeth, and this kind of acts like a sieve. And then it will trap the krill on the other side of their teeth, and then they can kind of lick that those krill off and eat those krill. So you're going to see they have these nice grooved teeth for that process of feeding and using them as kind of a sieve. Now here, if you look in your leopard seal, leopard seals will also feed on some krill, so they do have these kind of some grooves in their teeth, but not nearly as pronounced as your crab eater seal. And that's because leopard seals will also feed on things like penguins. And they'll do that especially during the breeding season when penguins are up on shore. And then what they'll do is they're actually quite stealthy, and they'll sit in the water and wait for the penguins to come in. And then they'll kind of, again, they have to be kind of very stealthy about this. And then what they'll do is as soon as a penguin comes in the water, they can actually accelerate quite rapidly in the water, up to 40 miles per hour. And they'll grab the penguin there. Now, again, they have to do this in a stealthy manner because if the penguin spots them and ends up hopping back up on land, once on land, the penguin is more agile than the seal. It's just kind of pulling itself along, and you can kind of picture them pulling their big bodies along and trying to haul out onto the ice. And they're really not very agile once they're on the ice. So they really need to feed on those. They need to catch the penguin while it's in the water. So again, crab eaters are primarily going to be feeding on krill, and they have, again, this cool dentition where, again, they have these grooves in the teeth to act like a sieve. And then leopard seals will eat mostly krill as well during most times of the year, but again, during breeding season, they'll take penguins. And you can see that, sorry, I forgot to show you that they do have these more well-developed canines for that, for capturing the penguins, versus you can see the crab-eater seals really have these kind of smaller canines. Leopard seals definitely have their more pronounced canines. And so you can see that here. Okay, so pinniped diets. Again, the majority of your pinnipeds, these were just kind of two really interesting feeders in terms of some of the different feeding strategies, but the vast majority of your pinnipeds are feeding on fish and squid. So the majority of them are feeding on, most of your seals and sea lions are feeding on fish and squid. I just picked these two as kind of, again, some really different feeding strategies for you to see in terms of how that feeding strategy fit their structure of their teeth, the dentition. But again, most of your pinnipeds, most of them are eating fish, most of them are eating squid. And so when we talk about some of the threats to pinnipeds, oftentimes anything that's threatening these fish populations is likely to be threatening pinniped populations as well. Remember, just as a reminder, what do walruses eat? They're primarily eating invertebrates, mostly bottom invertebrates like your clams and crabs and things like that. So let's talk really quickly about some of the threats that are out there to marine pinnipeds. And again, just as a reminder, all of your marine mammals are protected under this, in the United States, I should say, by this Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so again, it inhibits the harassing of any marine mammals along with the import or export of these marine mammal products. California sea lion populations now appear to be a bit more stable. However, they still are seeing threats to these populations from things like fishing pollution. So, you'll see some of these nets. A lot of times, some of these fishing boats will just kind of cut their nets free and kind of leave them out in the water, and this provides, pollution. Fishing, what we call fishing pollution. And so what that ends up doing is some of the fishing lines themselves or the fishing nets are quite enticing to these playful seals or sea lions. And so what they'll do is, you can see this sea lion, this is a sea lion in this case, you can see that external ear, ended up, probably trying to play with this net, and this discarded net, and instead had it trapped around its head. Now, unfortunately, once this happens, as they continue to grow, this can end up being, quite detrimental to them. And what will end up happening is, as they grow, this will kind of rub on their skin, and it'll actually grow into their skin a little bit. It'll ulcerate the skin, oftentimes causing infection, and it can even eventually cut through their trachea. So it's quite sad. It's kind of a painful and slow death. And so there are many organizations out there that they try to go out and identify these seals and sea lions that are in this situation and try to go out and remove that piece of debris that's trapped around them. So there are also threats to them via pollution. And so I put here, please read box 18.1 on microplastics. But what I want to show you really quick is this idea of what we call biological magnification. So, and this is one of our threats to our pinnipeds is, the heavy use of pesticides in our kind of near shore communities, agricultural communities. And what will happen is these pesticides will then be pulled into river runoff and then end up in these, end up in these running off into these estuarine communities. And then of course we have things like phytoplankton that will pick up these chemicals, and then as well as zooplankton. And then that phytoplankton and zooplankton is then fed on by, smaller fish, so things like anchovies. And then those smaller fish are then fed on by, more carnivorous fish, which are fed on by, even larger carnivorous fish. And what ends up happening is you end up concentrating the concentrations of these pesticides in these larger species. So this happens as you eat higher up in the food web. And this is one of the challenges, right, with the idea of eating a lot of tuna because of the, again, biological magnification of the mercury that's built up inside their tissues. So again, we can get the same thing. We have the same problem with things like your chlorinated hydrocarbons, which are from pesticides. And they end up, again, concentrating in the tissues of these smaller fish. Well, this larger fish eats a lot of this small fish. So they end up having a larger concentration of that pesticide. And then here, when you get up into seals and sea lions, and they're eating quite a bit of this carnivorous fish here. So as they're eating higher up on the food web, they're loading a lot more of this pesticide that is remaining inside their tissues, and they're unable to clear that out of their tissues. So this is called biological magnification when this happens with certain chemicals as they kind of move up through the food web. So this becomes a problem for some of our larger marine mammals here. And you can see the same thing will happen. We can also get biological magnification of microplastics in the food web as well. So again, as you eat higher up in the food web, oftentimes you are loading a higher load of these microplastics as plastics break down. And again, these microscopic portions of the plastics and the chemicals are taken up by these smaller organisms and eventually loaded into the tissues of these larger organisms. So again, that just kind of gives you an idea of some of those threats. This is kind of a neat video. You can look at this. It talks about, I'll let you kind of play these videos on your own, but there's one that's on stellar sea lions on Citizen Science at Work. This one's kind of, I'll play this one. This one's short. And you can kind of look at, please go and jump around here. You can see there's, a whole helping the stellar sea lion populations rebound. Especially there's two distinct stellar sea lion populations. There's one along the kind of west coast off the coast of California and Oregon and Washington there. And then there's another population of stellar sea lions that's up around Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. And for some reason, that population around Alaska and the Aleutian Islands is not rebounding nearly as fast as the other population, and they don't really know why. So you can kind of watch this video in terms of investigating that and then some of the things that they're doing to help protect those populations. But here, this is just a really quick.
In the age of selfies and social media, it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of being close to wildlife and sharing photos. For seals and sea lions that rest on our beaches, close encounters with people are harmful. Continued disturbances might cause mothers to abandon pups, or too close if an animal starts to stare, fidget, or flee.
But in her body language,
even if you don't see these reactions, keep yourself and your pets a safe distance from seals and sea lions to make sure you're not disrupting their behavior. It's a violation of federal law to harass seals and sea lions. Share the shore with these animals, but enjoy them from a safe distance to protect their health and yours.
Okay, so just kind of a quick message on, ensuring that, again, that harassing any of the marine mammals is a violation of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So again, if you have any questions on this, as always, please feel free to ask me. Marine mammals are always fun to talk about, and I wish I had you guys in lecture with me. But our last section of the marine mammal talks will be on cetaceans, and then that will wrap up marine mammals.